Genesis chapter 37 verse 1 to 36. Verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. Verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought to their father a bad report about them. Verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Verse 6. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had." Verse 7. We were binding sheaf of grains out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gather around mine and bow down to it. Verse 8. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Verse 9. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Verse 10. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Verse 11. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. Verse 13. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. Verse 14. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron when Joseph arrived at Shechem. Verse 15. A man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" Verse 16. He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" Verse 17. "They have moved on from here." The man answered, "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Verse 18. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Verse 19. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Verse 20. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Verse 21. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Verse 22. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. Verse 24. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" Verse 27. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. Verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, His brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cisterns and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Verse 29. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. Verse 30. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Verse 31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. Verse 32. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Verse 33. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been turned to pieces." Verse 34. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his sons many days. Verse 35. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianite sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Genesis chapter 38 verse 1 to 30. Verse 1. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. Verse 2. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shau. He married her and made love to her. Verse 3. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who was named Verse 4. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. Verse 5. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. She was a deceive that she gave birth to him. Verse 6. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Verse 7. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." Verse 9. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. Verse 10. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. Verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shau, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep. And his friend Hera, the Adullamite, went with him. Verse 13. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah," and sheared his sheep. Verse 14. She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that, though Shelah has now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Verse 15. When Judah saw her, she thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Verse 16. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. Verse 17. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. Verse 18. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your cell and its cord, and the staff in your hands," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Verse 19. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. Verse 21. He asked the men who lived there, Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Iniam? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. Verse 22. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Verse 23. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. Verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns this, she said, and she added, see if you recognize who sell uncord and stuff these are. Verse 26. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I didn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. Verse 27. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. Verse 28. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. Verse 29. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Verse 30. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah.